Ever been curious about what the future holds, or how life will be like in 10 to 50 years? Well, it's worse than you think. In the upcoming future, humans will be affected tremendously by greenhouse gases and aspects of radiation going into our environment and optics, impacts on human health, and how foreign chemicals can impact our environment. To start our broadcast, we have a very special guest who has a PhD in optical physics, Dr. Lerone. So how does optics affect the environment and greenhouse gases?
We see radiation refracts through the ozone layer and stratosphere into the troposphere, where greenhouse gases retain some of that radiation. So as of right now, 100% of that radiation from the sun is coming through our atmosphere, and when it hits the ozone layer, 30% of that is bouncing back up into space due to the light-colored greenhouse gases creating that barrier, and then 70% comes down to the surface of the earth, hitting the surface of the earth. Some of those greenhouse gases will bounce back up, but it's not a significant amount. 50 to 100 years from now, if we keep producing greenhouse gases at the rate that we're emitting them now, a thick layer of gases will build up at the ozone layer. And since the sun can't refract through that thick layer, more light will be bouncing off of that light opaque surface or translucent surface back into space, so less radiation will actually be reaching the surface of our Earth. This results in a cooling effect on the world. Further cooling will cause more snow than rain, more sea ice, ice sheets, glaciers, icebergs, and even ice shelves, which enhances the albedo effect. The albedo effect is basically when snow or ice covers the ground, more radiation bounces off and the Earth won't absorb any of it. So then we have an even further cooling effect, creating an even colder world. Even if we're in a heating phase, it could still decrease the globe's temperature.
Thank you for the insightful interview, Dr. Lerone. So pretty much what you just said was, as the world gets warmer, greenhouse gases can retain more radiation. From 50 to 100 years from now, the world will get cooler as greenhouse gases do not let light waves penetrate past our atmosphere. And as the albedo effect can cause a possible positive feedback loop to start a cooling period in our world. As the colder climate begins, it causes more ice and snow, and then goes to the albedo effect, and then it repeats. So moving on, now we'll talk about how does greenhouse gases 50 to 100 years from now affect our human bodies. With us today we have Nicholas Chen, who's a doctor in biology. How does biology relate anything to do with greenhouse gases? Well, I'll tell you. Firstly, the impacts of greenhouse gases are as follows mainly. There's rising oceans, there's increase in precipitation due to the atmosphere getting warmer and being able to hold in more liquid, and rising in temperatures. So, as temperatures rise, the atmosphere gets warmer, which, as I said again, it can retain more moisture, which leads to more rain, which can lead to more floods, and in third world countries can ruin topsoils. And that may not sound like a big deal, but some people rely on that. So, less topsoils / more floods, right? They can make worse farming conditions. This can lead to less food in poor countries, and this can lead to malnourishment in poor countries, like third world nations. So, what are the effects of malnourishment? Well, mainly there's less muscle tissue. You'll lose a lot of muscle tissue if you stop eating. You'll become very fatigued. Oftentimes your respiratory tract can fail you, and it can become difficult to breathe. Less platelets are being produced, so oftentimes wounds will last much longer. This is a big one. You have a weaker immune system because there's also less white blood cells within your body, and your body retains less heat because oftentimes your body's very good at breaking down food to create heat, but if it doesn't have that food, it can't really create the heat it needs to. Bodies can fail to digest foods entirely. Oftentimes that's in very significant cases. So as Dr. Lerone said, what if there is a cooling period? How will that affect human health? Firstly, the main thing will probably be hypothermia, which also is a cause of being too cold, which is also impacted in if you're malnourished. So, what are the effects of hypothermia on the human body? Well, firstly, it affects your respiratory system, which creates difficulties breathing. Secondly, it can create frostbite, which is when your circulatory system realizes that you're cold and it tries to move all the blood near the most important parts of your body, which are usually the middle, which can cause not enough blood flow to go to your tips of your fingers, the tips of your toes, which can make them even end up falling off in bad cases. It can cause fatigue and confusion, and it can cause slurred speech and impact the temporal lobe of your brain, which controls the auditory system. It can make you have difficulties speaking, understanding what is said, and things like that.
Sorry, there was an emergency in the lab. We're live? Okay. So, there are a lot of greenhouse gases that play a huge role in the heating of the globe and the breaking down of the ozone layer. To be more specific, CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, are the main greenhouse gas responsible for breaking down the ozone layer. They're released from coolants in fridges or aerosol cans. CFCs are emitted, and then they travel to the stratosphere, or the ozone layer. And once they get to the stratosphere, the CFCs are broken up by UV radiation. The UV radiation releases chlorine and actually breaks apart the chlorine-carbon bond. So chlorine catalytically destroys ozone. Forest fires are an example of incomplete combustion, where water vapor, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and carbon particles are released in the form of smoke, which causes breathing problems. I want to talk about a much smaller greenhouse gas in the pie chart of greenhouse gases. I want to talk about nitrous oxide. Now, nitrous oxide is a sliver of what's being produced, but it absorbs 300 times more radiation than carbon dioxide. So even if it's a much smaller amount, it's still keeping in that heat under the ozone layer much better than carbon dioxide does. Nitrous oxide is also one of the few non-naturally occurring greenhouse gases, as well as chlorofluorocarbons, the ozone killers. Another thing to note about nitrous oxide is that when it mixes with water, it creates nitric acid, which forms acid rain. It's nitric acid as acid rain. And that's bad for many reasons. Destroys habitats, takes down trees absorb the carbon dioxide.
How are we gonna fix this?
So, 2 things we can do to prevent further damage due to greenhouse gases in the next 50 to 100 years is we can increase vehicle fuel efficiency, because automobiles are responsible for 26% of greenhouse gas emissions. And another thing we can do is use renewable energy sources such as wind, tidal, geothermal, biomass, solar.
So a large amount of greenhouse gases and pollutants are caused by large companies and large industries. And a way we can stop this is enforcing by law cap and trade. So what cap and trade pretty much does is it gives companies an actual incentive to go under the emission amount by creating a lucrative incentive, such as money. And it punishes people who go over, as in they have to pay money to companies that go under to compensate for that. So on top of losing money, they're giving it to the competition, which creates a large incentive to create less emissions.
So here's a quick recap of what we've talked about so far. So the cause, increase in greenhouse gases over 50 to 100 years. Then we have the consequence, which is multiple consequences. Too much absorption of radiation causes greenhouse gas buildup, which makes our Earth warmer, but in turn, over 50 to 100 years can make our world colder because of that layer of light-colored gas at the ozone layer, which can reflect more light off.
It causes more topsoil to get removed, which has negative impacts on agriculture, which can hurt the third world, which relies on that.
And the breaking down of the ozone layer due to chemicals in the air.
So for solutions, one of the many solutions is cap and trade, which pretty much limits how much greenhouse gases companies can emit.
Renewable energy sources. We will use renewable energy sources like wind and solar, tidal and geothermal.
And increasing vehicle fuel efficiency. 26% of greenhouse gases are caused by vehicles, which is a big problem. If we increase the fuel efficiency, we can stop that.